for the sector comprising of agriculture, allied activities, irrigation and rural development, an allocation of 2.83 lakh crores has been made for 2020-21.
Massive push for the farm sector in the budget. A 16-point plan spelled out to boost the economy, including lakhs and crores of rupees of allocations.
In a big boost to the education sector, government allocates 99,300 crore to the crucial sector. Finance Minister promises to announce new education policy soon.
Ministry, members of parliament and other stakeholders.
The budget speech drags the markets, Sensex and Nifty, into the red. It's a thumbs down from Dalal Street for Nirmala Sitharaman's Budget 2020 speech. And that's what we're going to begin with. The markets in India giving a thumbs down to Budget 2020. We have our very own Sumit Chaturvedi joining us on the broadcast. Sumit, talk to us. Why are both the benchmark indices of India, Sensex and Nifty, deep in the red at this point in time?
Well, Krishna, from the last many days, a lot of hopes were building up. Clearly, there were expectations of long-term capital gains to be abolished. Well, that was something investors were hoping that will bring much needed relief to markets. But that didn't happen, and soon after that, the overall announcement was over of DDT getting dividend distribution tax getting abolished. Markets came down sharply, and since then they are coming down. Second big is the fiscal slippage. The fiscal, the GDP, the fiscal deficit will be now 3.8% of GDP for this financial year, from 3.3% earlier. 0.5% is a big number that way. So government will dip into its own, we will say that, funds or maybe own treasuries to fund this deficit. These two clearly factors are not taken very lightly by the market, and markets have spooked on this these two announcements. Though in the morning today, some positives were there, like auto numbers, so markets were in positive territory also. But as soon as this announcement on markets was over from FM side, DDT was abolished, but LTCG didn't come. Markets started slipping, and main two reasons are again the LTCG long-term capital gains not coming for investors, and fiscal deficit also widening from 3.3% to 3.8%. Also, government has revised FY19 GDP growth downwards. That's another factor. Combining all that, the markets have shown a thumbs down to the budget now.
Right. Sumit, as we speak, Sensex dangerously close to dipping below that 40,000 mark, and the Nifty as well slipping down to the 11,700 levels. Not good signs of the market. I also wanted to ask you were telling us that today is a special trading session. It's the 1st of February. That's why the markets are open this budget day. But the real impact of the budget will only be seen by Monday's trading.
Well, yes, absolutely, Krishna. Today, on the special request of traders, government had gone for this special 1 day of trading. It's like Muhurta trading on Diwali. But the settlements all will happen on Monday only. They have been given T plus 2 days, which means that whatever is bought today can't be sold today. On Monday, we can see more selling coming. But mature traders will take one more day to absorb the news. But clearly, as we speak now, these two news or factors have clearly spooked investors there. They were not, first they were expecting LTCG to come for them, and they were not expecting government to go for this kind of fiscal deficit, which shows the state of the economy. All other we can say that announcements are either for the individual taxpayer like you and me, or agriculture sector, education sector. So stock specific activities there, they have gone up, but in a broader way, markets have come down. They're still coming down. Or we can say that they were looking for some cue to shed the gains also.
Thank you, Sumit. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. But Ami, coming to you first, your first reaction on the budget. Has it gone for a structural reform? Has it been able to address the issues which were plaguing the Indian economy in terms of agriculture, tax slabs? Or you think that the changes are cosmetic?
I think that, Nirmala Sitharaman, in her very long budget speech, did try to outline a vision of India, aspirational India with improved services and better jobs, economic development, and a caring and compassionate society. But a lot of the things that were outlined that we heard in the speech were merely kind of nods to issues without really outlining clear plans.
But there was a substantive part. The first 45 minutes, they were devoted to Indian agriculture.
But even many of those things were not that specific. So she made some comment about balanced fertilizer use and reducing overuse on chemical fertilizers. But there was really no clarity. I mean, a lot of people believe that India really needs to peel back its fertilizer subsidy, which costs a lot and causes a lot of distortions in the market. So there was this kind of allusion to it, balanced use of fertilizers. But actually, there's nothing concrete of like, we are reducing and the way that then when you got into the tax proposals, it was like between 5 lakh and 7 lakh. I mean, everything was absolutely micro-detailed. You know exactly what is going to happen. On these agriculture things, there's a lot of big indications of like, we know what needs to be done, but they're not actually saying what they're going to do.
But there are a lot of, new things in the budget, though small. For example, Delhi and other metropolitan cities have been plagued with bad air. For the first time in a budget, we had a component of 4,000 crore rupees for clean air.
I think there were anti-pollution allocations in previous budgets also, actually. I'm not sure that it's the first time. I remember a couple of years ago, former finance minister, the late finance minister, Arun Jaitley, talking about anti-pollution.
But the clean air is the first.
Yeah, well, also talking about Delhi, we're looking at the elections in Delhi a week down the line. It's hard for me not to read political signals through the budget where the ruling BJP is in a tough combat against the Aam Aadmi Party in the Delhi elections. So I'm just saying that it's fantastic that the central government does make an allocation, but as probably Amy was talking about, more needs and more specificities about these investments would really help us understand how much of a change we can make when it comes to the national capital's air. But in the meanwhile, Kartikeya, we were discussing some surprises in this budget. We will come to surprise by surprise. I'm going to begin with one surprise. Amy, you want...
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest one other thing. I mean, when you talk about kind of lack of detail and lack of specificity in terms of like the vision and what is the reform roadmap, she again made some talk about some of the new consolidated, public sector banks going to the capital markets. But again, there was very little detail. It was like some, and they'll be encouraged to go to the capital markets. It's not clear whether they'll be listing more shares or whether they'll be going to the bond market. So I just think there wasn't like a clear vision.
And that's what Kartikeya, that's what the big one is the tax. The other big announcement, talking about the capital markets and etc., is a big surprise announcement, the biggest surprise possibly from Budget 2020, and that is taking India's national insurer, the Life Insurance Corporation of India, LIC, to the markets, something that's debated and discussed. Richard M. Rosso joining us on the broadcast. That one came out of nowhere, or rather it was building up to that, because the outlay on so many things, lakhs and crores of rupees, needs to be funded one way or the other. And one of the best ways of doing that is divesting stake, and what better place to start than the LIC?
Well, it's a funny thing when you talk about offering an IPO for LIC. On a good year, life insurance, surprising to a lot, makes up about 4 to 5% of India's GDP, life insurance premiums. It is a monster part of the economy that doesn't get a lot of discussion. And LIC, despite 20 years now of private competition being allowed, still dominates anywhere between 60 and 70% of life insurance.
65% of the market.
Yeah. So the fact that, and it's also the primary kitty. I mean, when you talk about government disinvestment targets, a lot of times it's simply having groups like LIC and SBI buy shares, not really offering. So when you offer an IPO, private firms begin to play a bigger stake. Is it going to operate then like a commercial entity? Because you remember a few years ago, a UK firm had actually sued the government of India over mandates given to Coal India. They bought shares in Coal India, but Coal India was making decisions based on politics, not on good business sense. So LIC has to change its ways a little bit.
But there was a very, the takeaway of the LIC was for the fiscal management. That's the word which the finance minister used.
There's a huge, and that's because we've seen in this budget, Kartikeya, the kind of outlays for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. 130 lakh crore
53,700 crores for scheduled tribes and
about 85 odd for scheduled
85,000
so 133 lakh crore rupees of outlay for the lower caste in the country, and about another lakh crore rupees for 100 lakh crore rupees for education. So the money needs to come from somewhere to fund all of these huge outlays. Maybe you can take that question to Andrew Whitehead, who joins us in the broadcast. Andrew, talk to us these massive outlays for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the education sector and the agricultural sector, and LIC finally being put on the block. Your thoughts?
LIC took me by surprise. I think it's a bold move. It's one of the few headlines in this speech. Wow, what a marathon speech, and what a strange end when the finance minister seemed to more or less just give up and sit down rather than having a closing peroration. And for the first 2 hours, apart from the brief preamble, which actually had a little bit of vision to it, it was a list. It was a Babu budget. It was one thing after another. The amounts of money being pledged were high. And when you actually got the summation of it, hugely high. So if I've got the figures right, she said total government spending of 27 lakh crores, total government receipts of 19 lakh crores. So the government is spending 50% more than it's receiving in revenues, there or thereabout. That is a huge fiscal deficit. There were some other things that struck me. Why is she saying that there's a notional GDP for the coming financial year of 10%? Her own economic survey said 6% to 6.5%. I was very curious about that. And then the income tax announcement, which is the one that's going to get attention, especially, of course, among WION's viewers. She says she's simplifying the structure. She announces lower rates and says you'll be paying less, but you'll probably lose your deductions and exemptions. Or you can pay the current rates and keep your deductions and exemptions. Rather suggests there's two parallel systems. That's not a simplification.
So, Andrew, as we were discussing, was it a reformist budget or was it a statist budget in line of creating a large welfare infrastructure?
No, it wasn't. It was a progressive budget, and as much as there's more spending for social purposes, she is trying to boost consumption. But there's not very much here, with the LIC announcement apart, that really talks to serious structural reform. A lot of the themes about emphasis on digital, on education, on maternal services, and indeed on environmental issues, we have heard before. So in terms of something that's new, bright, and actually is going to actually achieve something, and is a statement of what this government's plan is to get India's economy out of this current mess, I didn't spot very much. And I think that's one of the reasons why the markets have given it a bit of a thumbs down.
We are also joined by Mr. Bhanumurthy. Mr. Bhanumurthy, your first thought on the budget presented by Nirmala Sitharaman?
Yeah, I think it was a very long budget. It was very difficult to absorb whatever she was saying. But I guess the details would be, we need to look at the details a little more careful. We need to spend more time on the document that is placed in the parliament. Having said that, there's a little bit of disappointment, but at the same time, some of the measures that the finance minister has taken should help some kind of a revival in the consumption demand. I think major policy that almost rationalizing the direct tax structure across the board is something is very, very welcoming, not necessarily only on the corporate taxes. I think she actually broadened it to the personal income tax, as well as dividend distribution tax.
But why has the market collapsed today? The market is down 700 points.
Yeah, maybe I think the market expectations were a little more than that. Maybe they were looking forward for the LTCG to address. Maybe that's where the disappointment seems to be coming up. But at the same time, as another speaker said, market seems to react much more to the slippage on the fiscal side, where the government has actually used this escape clause of 0.5%, not just for 1 year, but also for next couple of years. Maybe we need to look at that medium-term fiscal framework, whether it is going to be using that escape clause even in 2021-22. So the overall, I think the market seems to be reacting particularly on the fiscal slippage and also on the disappointment on the LTCG. I think one of the speakers was saying that the 10% growth, but actually Finance Minister made very clear it is only the nominal GDP growth. So actually it comes to the real GDP growth of 6 to 6.5% if you assume the inflation of 3.5 to 4%. So I'm not worried about that part of it, but I think what is more worrying is that there are a lot of statements about the financial sector, but not really specific policy measures to really revive the overall financial sector. I was talking
but
to
Mr.
you in the
Bhanumurthy,
morning.
yes, that's a
where,
pertinent point.
There are many.
It's a pertinent point, but if you go by the data, 40,000 crore extra money would be released in market in context of the new tax slabs. The relief which has been given. Will it work in terms of spending?
No, I don't think so. But I think we need to really look at how. The details need to be looked at. A lot of measures that she said. I think conditional upon many things. So we need to look at the finance bill, how this is going to be play out. I don't really think that makes a big difference. But I was basically looking at some of the measures specifically for the public sector banks. And she short of saying regarding the recapitalization of banks, she said that we already done so much. But I think the problems in the public sector banks doesn't seem to stop. Rather, it is increasing day by day. Once with these Mudra loans also come into picture, I think the NPA situation is going to worsen. So, what is the roadmap for the public sector banks was something that we are looking forward. And LIC, I think that looks a little scary. We thought LIC is the one which used to rescue most of the public sector banks. And now disinvestment of some part of the LIC is again going to create some uncertainty in the overall public sector. Then one last point about, again, slightly disappointed about the tariffs that the finance minister started putting on some of the imported items. I think, again, there is a disconnect between what Economic Survey said yesterday and what the proposals that is being made in the budget today.
Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy joining us on the broadcast. Thank you so much. Stay with us, sir. We have more new guests joining in on this broadcast. We also have Mr. Jayant Krishna joining us, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Risk, CSIS. And we also have, he's also been with the NSDC as the CEO before this. Mr. Jayant Krishna, thank you so much. We welcome you on the broadcast. Quick thoughts, if I were to ask you a quick take, your initial reaction to Budget 2020.
I think except the infra space and, agro-rural development kind of a thing, I somehow could not see big ideas in the budget.
If I were to ask you a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rate this budget?
Perhaps 7.
7, that's still a good rating on the budget that you're giving. Any particular reason for according to you, the most important thing about this budget that's pushing it above the above average mark?
Because there's a lot of rural distress, there's a lot of farmer distress, farmer suicides are happening and so on and so forth. At least there is a distinct story about doubling the farmer's income by 2022. Governments have said this before as well, but at least this time this seems to be a little more credible in terms of rural logistics, cold storages, and things like that.
The outlays for agriculture that have been
That's
mentioned.
right. Outlay has also been increased. So I think I see some hope, but a lot in India depends upon how you actually implement it. The last mile issues, a lot of schemes, a lot of policy initiatives look very good on paper.
Yes.
But how the execution happens. But for me, it's an opportunity missed when it comes to skilling and education, even healthcare. The allocations have not gone up that substantially. If Ayushman Bharat has to become a reality or skill development, the new education policy, for example, they're talking about increasing the GDP, education spend as a public.
99,300 crore rupees for education.
But the increase is not very substantial. Last time was 93,000 crore. Kind of a thing.
Fair enough.
If education spend as a percentage of GDP has to go up from 2.7% to 6% in next 4 or 5 years' time, we should have seen part of it happening in this budget.
The 7 rating, fair enough, because some of the allocations have been maintained for important sectors like healthcare and agriculture, but nothing outlandish, nothing that stands out at this point in time, which prevents it from becoming a 10 on 10 or a 9 on 10 budget. It's a good time then to get a check-in on what the rating of the budget is at this stage, at the early stage of discussions, less than an hour after the budget has been presented. Let me begin with Andrew Whitehead, who joins us live from Chennai. Andrew, if I were to ask you a rating quickly out of 10 for Budget 2020.
I'd say 5. I found the lack of vision really worrying. I don't think there was a really strong chord. I'm still not quite sure how this government is going to tackle the dip in GDP growth. I'm not quite sure it's got a convincing reason for that. And I'm slightly worried that the income tax measure might have been done with half an eye on the Delhi Assembly elections.
Wow, that's a very interesting point. We have to discuss that. The income tax slabs, it gets discussed, over-discussed with every single budget. Fact of the matter is that just about 7% of the Indian population is a tax-paying population. That's the reality overall. But still, for all the viewers watching this with all the curiosity, Amy, if I were to ask you, what did you think about the recalibration of the income tax slabs this time around?
So look, there is obviously a sense that, salaried people who are, do pay a lot of income tax compared to other people that work in other sectors of the economy. So some relief for them has been a long-standing demand. I think it's clear that the way they announce these tax slabs is that they really tried to calibrate it, to give it to those who really can be considered kind of the lower middle class. There's a big issue about if you give a big cut in personal income taxes, you forego revenue, but will the people who now get this additional money in their hands really spend it, or will they just stock it away in their bank accounts? It's clear that they tried to give it to those that they think have the highest propensity to spend, and no break for those earning over 15 lakh.
Krishna, this reminds me of railway budgets. If you look at the railway budgets of 90s and early 2000s, they were about commitment. So every time a rail minister would come, he would commit himself to build huge railway grid, reform it, earn money.
And the fares for second class.
But the next year, the same commitments would be done, but the deadlines would not be met. Now, if you look at the budget, Nirmala Sitharaman has spoken about creating 2 to 5 smart cities with PPP. That's a very small component of the budget. But it reminds me of one of the speeches of the Prime Minister in 2015 when he spoke of building 100 smart cities in the country. Now, today they are talking about upgrading 50 airports. Now, we have not been able to build one airport in Jhevar. We have not been able to fully modernize the almost dysfunctional airport in Mangalore. These are small episodes. But
and in this budget, we're talking about a promise of 100 airports.
But they reflect larger millions of the bureaucratic grid which we have created in the last 50 years. So, this budget reminds me of promises, big promises which are being made. But then do we have the wherewithal to actually keep those promises? And smart city is an example in case. 100 cities were promised in 2015. And now we are talking about 2 to 5 smart cities with PP.
Public-private
participation.
Richard and Russell, that question goes to you. What kind of a confidence do you think it inspires in the minds of investors when you say 100 airports now? Because they've seen what happened with 100 smart cities.
Not a whole lot. Frankly, investing in infrastructure anyways, at least for the foreign investment community, is a loser's game. The ability to earn returns on infrastructure investments, the promises by state governments, state utilities, and even the center, are very light. The ability to sue the government is non-existent. So infrastructure for the foreign investment community really isn't the place that they necessarily go to. Except for kind of the back end side there. You did see some, one of the interesting announcements too was this idea that sovereign wealth funds, if they agree to park their money for a certain period of time, can leave it in market and pull out capital gains tax-free. But
capital gains are not tax-free even now because LTCG, long-term capital gains tax remains, and that's the reason why the markets have been tanking for the day, Richard. Sensex flirting with going below the 40,000 mark. We need to check the latest figures, but down 700 points since the budget speech. But there are other things to consider over here. This is an important budget, as we've been talking about. It comes a week before the Delhi elections. On your screens now, Sensex and the Nifty. Sensex at 40,070. 1.6% in the red, while Nifty at 11,600. 1.64% in the red. We'll have to see how it's going to pan out for the rest of the trading session. And more importantly, what happens when the markets open for trading on Monday morning. So a lot can happen between Saturday and Monday in terms of how the budget's fine print is read, to be precise, isn't it, Kartika? The next 48 hours, this budget, how people are going to react come Monday morning.
See, when she was reading her budget, the first 45 minutes, I felt that, this is Budget Bharat, There were a lot of announcements, there was a great focus. Detailing was being done by Nirmala Sitharaman. If you actually go into the first 40 minutes of her speech, she speaks about Jal Jeevan Mission, she'll take you through skill set development, 3,000 crore. You have investment, as you mentioned, 1.7 lakh crore, which is transport infrastructure, 80,000 crore for National Mission Quantum Technology, 85,000 crore for SC and backward caste, 53,700 crore for ST developments. But what I feel as an individual is there was, as mentioned by one of our panelists, a lack of big idea. 1991
that vision
was a
that
big
you've been
idea.
talking about.
And surprisingly in this budget, we had a mention of national security as a component. It very rarely happens, though she was quoting a very renowned poet, but the part on which the emphasis came was on national security.
Was this when she was quoting Kalidasa?
She was quoting a Tamil poet.
Thiruvalluvar as well,
yes.
the famous Tamil poet Thiruvalluvar, quoted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi on occasion, now quoted by Nirmala Sitharaman for the second time in the second budget speech that she delivered in 7 months. Again, I'm going to get back to some of these allocations over here. Budget is but an allocation statement. At the end of the day, they talk about how much money you're going to spend, how much money you're going to come back. While we've discussed the allocations so far, even the markets have taken into account the fact that the fiscal deficit, this technical term that haunts the Indian economy, the deficit between what India earns and what India spends, it's called the fiscal deficit, that as a percentage of GDP is said to be nearly 4%, 3.8, whereas the estimation originally was 3.3, now it's going to be 3.8. For the coming year, the estimate is 3.5. And Amy Kasman, there's no guarantee that we're going to have 3.5% fiscal deficit come 2021.
That's right. I mean, the fiscal deficit target is a target, and there's no guarantee that you're going to meet it. This year, the fiscal deficit target was supposed to be 3.3% of GDP. Now she's admitting that they're going to overshoot that, and it's actually going to be 3.8% of GDP because tax revenues...
For the year gone by.
Well, for the year that will end on March 31st,
yes.
Basically. So tax revenues are falling short, disinvestment revenues are falling short. So, and the reason that this is important is because if the government has a wider fiscal deficit and has to borrow too much money, it makes it harder for the companies to borrow. It makes it more expensive and harder for companies to borrow for their private investment needs. So it pushes up the cost of financing for everybody.
Absolutely. Krishna, what do you think of this? Now details are coming out. The defense pension bill is up from 1.1 lakh crore, which is OROP, to 1.3 lakh crore in this budget.
If I can take that question, if you can talk to us, sir, in terms of how do you think something like this, for something like OROP and the Defence Commission, this kind of an allocation, what does it signify anything particular?
Sorry, what's the percentage increase?
The OROP increase has been from 1.1 lakh crore from last year to 1.3 lakh crores. Yeah. The whole debate in the last 3 to 4 years was to control it. And if I'm not wrong, Prime Minister and then Minister of State for Information Broadcasting, Major Rajyavardhan Rathore, had spoken with the veterans, but nothing came out of it. And now it has increased.
Yeah, so I'm sure, this is based on sound arithmetic, because, all defense people working, retired, they all, have their kitty available and, how much. So this must be exact mathematics. This is not just a projection, for a new scheme being announced that how many people will be the beneficiaries. This must be a very, very accounting rule book kind of a calculation, I'm sure.
Right. Quickly, we have to let go of Professor Bhanumurthy, who joins us from the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Professor Bhanumurthy, before we let go of you, I want to ask you, the biggest concern at this point in time, be it for the stock markets or for anybody else with this budget, is the fact that the amount of deficit that the Indian government incurs from its operations, from exporting to importing and expenditure to revenues, is increasing consistently.
Yeah, I think that's a cause for concern. Now, most importantly, what I'm seeing is that for the next financial year, the government seems to be targeting a disinvestment of 2.1 lakh crore. And I think that seems to be a very weak number in the overall fiscal math. Now, despite that, the government is going to run a fiscal deficit of 3.3%. However, what is more important is that we need to look at what is happening to this 3.3%, whether is there any increase in the capital expenditure. The finance minister's speech said that it is going to increase the capital expenditure. If that happens, I think that would act as a fiscal stimulus for the current situation. Many of us have been arguing that at this juncture it is the fiscal policy that needs to be more proactive when especially there is a decline in the demand. So to that extent, the finance minister seems to have gone into expansionary fiscal policy where as we heard that any increase in the fiscal deficit is going for capital expenditure that should help in reviving the overall growth. As I said in the beginning, like 6 to 6.5% growth for the next year is going to be aspirational. If the fiscal deficit increase is going to help revive the GDP growth, I think that is very welcoming.
Professor N.R. Bhanamurthy from the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy joining us on the broadcast with that perspective. Thank you so much for being with us, sir, and sharing your thoughts. We continue with our budget coverage and analysis. For those keeping keeping score at home, for individuals out there who smoke, things are going to get a little more difficult from after this budget because the cost of cigarettes and tobacco is going to go up. So you can expect some stocking up that usually happens in India before and after the budget. But getting back to the big topic, India's growth story. Andrew Whitehead with us on the broadcast. Andrew, if I were to ask you, that is the tough balancing act that was up against Nirmala Sitharaman, when she started preparing this 2020 budget. Andrew is going to join us in just a bit. Let me take this across to Richard. This was a foregone conclusion. This was a tough balancing act. You have to revive growth, but you cannot allow to spend too much. It's like, catch-22. Damn it if you do, damn it if you don't. But from that perspective, how do you view this budget?
Well, you sort of wish that the things they do to try to trigger growth weren't things that, especially if it impacts the fiscal deficit, that it wasn't things that they couldn't remove later on. And if part of triggering growth is these tax cuts, that's very difficult to try to add back on later on. So I do think they set in stone, some initiatives trying to combat the slowdown that are going to be difficult to roll back later, which that worries me quite a bit. As was mentioned before by the panelists, some of the other things like infrastructure spend that can get people employed, can get things moving, but it causes implementation issues. So a lot of it that could be long-term beneficial, as well as offering short-term stimulus, a piece of paper and a speech doesn't make it happen. So check back in a year and we'll see whether or not there's been movement.
But Krishna, isn't it surprising that despite dividend distribution tax being done away with, the Exchequer will have a loss of 25,000 crore rupees. It would have had a positive impact, but Nifty is down by 11,800 points and Sensex slipped by 700. Why has that happened? People thought that this would work in a different direction.
From the way it looks right now, as far as the pure market...
I'm surprised why a market has reacted on DDT.
I think it remains a paradox because this was the single biggest ask of the stock market.
Absolutely,
yes.
absolutely.
So I don't understand why.
Yeah, but the other explanation, Karthika, at this stage that we have, we will continue to read the fine print of this budget, is the fact that the LTCG, the long-term capital gains tax, has not been done away with. That makes a huge difference to those trading in the markets on a daily basis because that's what they earn from. That's their income. So the long-term capital gain tax, or the LTCG, has not been done away with, and that is a reaction. That's what our colleague Sumit Chaturvedi was also talking about. The traders in the markets who are buying and selling stocks on a daily basis, it's them reacting to it. But come Monday morning, a different picture might emerge, Karthikeya, because the DDT, as rightly being pointed out, the dividend distribution tax has been done away with. That brings down the corporate tax rates. Amy Kasman, despite the DDT being done down with, the corporate tax rates in India is still amongst the highest in the world. So the companies have been complaining.
See, I think one thing that I'd like to kind of pick up on that Andrew Whitehead mentioned earlier, which is the lack of vision. I mean, when you're presenting a budget and you have an economy that's in the grip of a very serious slowdown that has slowed for 6 consecutive quarters, until now, all we've heard from the government is, it's kind of global economy is slowing down, and so we're also slowing down. But I think maybe somehow, even though perhaps this was like an unrealistic hope, is that companies, businesses, traders were hoping for something like a big vision where you analyze what is the state of the world economy? What is your place in the world economy as India? What are the opportunities that you have now? What are the kind of challenges that you face now, and how are you going to reorganize your economic structure? It is like a big vision. Instead, it's like we're going to grow more algae and we're going to increase fish production, and there's not really like a sense that there really is a clear understanding of what's happening in the global economy. How does this affect India? What do we need to do in order to kind of take the country forward in these circumstances? What are our big opportunities? What are our lack of opportunities? There is not a big vision.
Amy, you're talking about Andrew, and he gave a 5 on 10 rating for the budget. And I know what your rating is. It's even below 5 for sure.
I mean, I don't do this kind of numerical rating. I find it not very useless. I don't, this is not my thing. But I mean, yeah.
Yes, we won't do that thing with you because your thoughts on the budget are very clear.
To Amy's point too, there had been some good ideas generated just yesterday if you go through and read the economic survey, they do, in a data-driven way, approach some of the issues that hurt the economy. I mean, crony capitalism and issues of, trade. They talk about trade. Trade deals have been good. India's, benefited. And then you get the budget speech the day after where, she attacks violently trade. I mean, that was one of the areas that, frankly, put the biggest chill down my spine. Is as much as India is becoming kind of a global pariah, particularly the United States, on trade, it appears to be getting a whole lot worse. She throws out at the end of her speech, she wanted to crowdsource sectors where India should impose new trade barriers. Crowdsource. And just yesterday, the Ministry of Finance that she represents had talked about trade deals were actually good for the country. So, when they do good thinking, too, sometimes it doesn't translate into policies the very next day.
Amy, I'm not going to say anything. Amy Kasman, please go ahead. You were waiting to comment on that.
Did you just say that India was a pariah in global trade?
Yeah.
I didn't say it. He said it.
Well. We're still working on a deal with the US from what we understand from the government. We're still working on a better deal with free trade agreements with many countries.
I think the larger point is like this. There is a statute, tax rights have been inserted. But will it actually do away with the problems of tax? That's the issue. But that's the most ironical part. If you just go back and remember the campaign of 2014, the biggest criticism actually of the UPA by Prime Minister Modi was then that you are making laws after laws after laws, but you are not thinking about implementing what you have. So you have one scheme after another scheme, but it's not about implementing what you have on hand. So you have issues of what the word the tax terrorism or tax harassment. So you have a tax charter, but it's about, can you implement that in a diverse country like this? Do you think that the cases would be solved in time-bound manner?
It's a very important point to bring up because that's
4.83 lakh crore direct tax cases in various appellates. Not my data.
Absolutely. No, and also there has been a clear message being sent out in terms of, it's not about harassing the rich for wealth creators, to be specific. That's what the budget document that was read by Nirmala Sitharaman said. So clearly there is an effort to reach out to the ultra wealthy of the country and letting them know that we're taxing you. It's normal. Everybody pays tax and you pay tax. We're not exactly tormenting you with tax, so to speak. Richard.
Well, we did see, when Modi came in, a pretty good approach, as they promised, on combating tax terrorism. They blocked new cases of retrospective taxation. They offered new parameters for cross-border trade and services. They dramatically slashed the number of pending trade disputes that the United States and India had. So good moves there. So, you've actually seen them carry out in the first term in the early years some pretty good steps to combat tax terrorism. I have informally from companies that as the budget numbers in the government, as the econ slows down, there are more aggressive attempts to collect tax. So, frankly, hearing those words, I think with this government that's had a pretty good track record when they pay attention. I mean, when they take their hand off the throttle on cracking down on tax terrorism, it's gotten pretty bad. So right. I do hope that they get back to it because with the slowing economy, it's a big fear.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Jayant. Last budget, if you remember, and last budget you remember, there was a lot of focus on Make in India and Made in India. A new word has been coined now, assembled in India. What has happened?
See, I won't bother too much about these coinages and semantics. What takes off on the ground is very important. See, one thing here in this context, I wanted to see. Yesterday in the economic survey, it was said that India must reduce the import barriers and tariff, especially for those goods which go as an input for exports, kind of a thing. So I was expecting those announcements today in the budget, but from whatever part of the speech that I heard, I didn't find that at all. It was very, very disappointing.
The biggest criticism on Twitter right now is that the officers of the finance ministry did not read economic survey of India properly.
So this is last few years that have been happening. The economic survey and the budget, they are not in sync, kind of thing.
Talking about the economic survey, very important point. The economic survey, National Economic Survey of India, and the budget has not been in sync for the last couple of years. It's been a factor. Talking about the National Economic Survey, it promised 8 crore jobs by the year 2030. 4 crore high-paying jobs by the year 2025 itself, and that is by bringing the focus on assemble in India, or by making companies invest in assembling operations in India and assemble their products here in India. I'm going to take that question to Mr. Andrew Whitehead, who joins us back on the broadcast live from Chennai. Andrew, talk to us. If there was one other question. No, go ahead, please go ahead.
I was going to say, make in India or assemble in India, I don't think it really very much matters. If it's making money for India and it's making jobs for people here in India, then it counts. But I think it is the case that the economic survey and the budget speech seem to be heading in different directions. They are divergent, and even divergent in presentational terms. So I thought one of the more engaging aspects of the economic survey was what's been termed Talinomics, so actually working out in different parts of the country how long people have got to work to be able to afford a veg thali or a non-veg thali for all their family members. And that's quite a good practical way of measuring increased spending power. I just wondered whether the finance minister might make some reference to that in her speech. Now, I didn't hear every minute of it because there were a few power cuts in my part of vibrant India, but I didn't hear her doing that. But if I can also, just at a tangent, if I may.
Power cut is normal in Chennai, and you know that.
I do, but nevertheless, when the finance minister was basically saying, we've got a fantastic power regime, not down here today we don't. Yeah, it's not surprising, but nevertheless, it's just a reminder.
Some things don't change, do they?
But you're also, Kartika, you were saying earlier about, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's quite interesting, the Tamil poet who Nirmala Sitharaman quoted from. Her first adventure into poetry during today's speech was actually to quote a Kashmiri poet and to quote him in Kashmiri. And she said that was Pandit Dinanath Kaul. Well, I think I'm right in saying that he was also known as Nadeem. And in the 1940s, he was a deeply political poet. He was a leftist and he was a Kashmiri nationalist, a supporter of Sheikh Abdullah. Now, that's quite an interesting choice.
Wow, where did we go with that,
Krishna,
Andrew?
I give up. I'm leaving. He won.
Because in that context, after she quoted the Kashmiri poet, and then she quoted the Tamil poet, she spoke on national security. But another detail has come in. The defence budget has been reduced to 10.1% from 10.6%. Last time it was 10.6, which was revised and became 11.7. Now it stands at 10.1.
Lower allocation for defence being the big surprise over here from 10.6% to 10.1%.
And I thought I missed it in her speech because there was no mention of the data, the detail.
Usually a bigger one than talking about one rank, one pension.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, this is again, last couple of years I've been seeing that budget doesn't have as much detail as typically 10 years back or even 5-6 years back the way budget used to have. So it's very difficult, it's very, very difficult to, unless you look at the fine print and look at the entire budget, the schedules and so on and so forth. It's very, very difficult to make any inference, at all. And especially if India, on one hand, we are saying we are tightening our security and so on and so forth, which is paramount. On the other hand, if defense budget doesn't go up, then the two things are not in sync.
Right. And there's one useful thing that's been happening on defense, too, that I doubt this is the case for such a steep drop year on year right now. But they have done some useful things to try to encourage the development of defense startups. So if some of the potential R&D and personnel costs and such are now being borne by the private sector independently, I mean, ultimately procurement of those systems only go to the government of India. But if some of those R&D expenditures and things are being held by the private sector now, it's a good thing. Again, that can't possibly at this infant stage make up for that big of a gap.
Absolutely.
But over time, it may reduce somewhat the reliance because the private sector is starting to pick up.
So that's again specific to the defense sector. Let's bring it back to the larger picture. Is there a vision? Budget 2020 was supposed to walk the tightrope. It was not meant to be an easy budget because of the way the economy is functioning, how the macroeconomics of India is. Andrew Whitehead, Amy Kasman has been talking to us about this lack of vision, which is the most worrying thing about this budget. Not a clear idea as to how are you going to bring growth back. You cut income taxes. There's no guarantee that the middle class will take the extra money and spend it on the economy and boost demand. They might just keep it at home, so there's no guarantee on that front. And more importantly, how are you going to finance it? Your divestment targets have not met with the greatest of response in the recent times.
Yeah, I mean, there was a social vision in the preamble to her speech, but I don't think there was an economic vision. I don't think there was a sustained policy vision. And this is the second time when she's delivered a budget speech, Nirmala Sitharaman, and really failed to provide that. First time round, you could say, well, she'd only been in office a few weeks. You could excuse it. But she's now been in office, 8 months? And I think it is about time that we got that vision. And instead, we didn't get quality, really. We just got quantity. A long, long, long list of spending commitments, often done in the form of a list. You know, here's my 12th of 16 points. Here's my 13th of 16 points, with quite a lot of repetition, just in case her audience just hadn't quite gathered what she'd been saying, which was the reason why this was such a marathon speech. I'd have preferred a much shorter speech, but a much more focused speech. And I think telling people here what they really want to hear, that this government has a plan about how to restore economic growth. And I think it's got a whole load of thoughts, but I'm not sure it's got anything that I would call a strategic plan.
Andrew Whitehead, Andrew, you're going to have somebody agreeing with you twice over. That's Amy Casbin who wants to come around. Amy, please go ahead.
No, I mean, all I want to say is, I think we should be careful about, like, whatever failings that we see in the budget, we should be careful about, like, should we personalize them and say it's Nirmala Sitharaman who, has failed to provide the vision. I mean, one is aware that in this government, power and decision-making is highly consolidated and centralized in the Prime Minister's office. I mean, I think that release of the Prime Minister sitting with business executives to hear their suggestions for the economy, and Nirmala Sitharaman was nowhere to be seen in that photo. So that really, raises the question of how much is this really her budget, or how much is this kind of, is she the messenger of of a vision or a lack of vision that's coming straight from the Prime Minister's office.
Let's ask somebody who has worked with the NSDC and Skill India, Mr. Jayant Krishna, care to weigh in on that? See, who presents the budget in India?
Well, I mean, it's a collective exercise. It's a collective exercise.
Whose budget is it? Big right question.
See, essentially, it is the Prime Minister's government, and so it has to have his stamp. I mean, that's very much. So I think it's a bit unfair to say that the Finance Minister was not wholly involved. I mean, but I mean, it's always the case. It's a collective reflection of the wisdom and the direction and the vision of the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. But I am disappointed on the job front. I mean, I don't see big ideas on the job front except to create some kind of a body for recruitment and all that. If you look at the MSME sector today, that already accounts for almost 28% of the GDP of the country, both manufacturing and service sector put together, right? And the MSME minister talks about
MSME as in micro and small, medium enterprises.
Absolutely. And the minister, Gadkari, has talked about taking it to 50%, the employment is about 11 to 12 crore people are directly employed in the MSME sector, and we're talking about taking it to 15 crore level, So there I was expecting some big ideas to happen. For example, I mean, we were pushing for a reform that today, a lot of MSME sector units, they don't have the access to mentors, to advisors, to consultants, and which becomes a constraint in their growth. Can we create a technology framework based on, where MSME units become seekers of knowledge and inputs and consulting and mentoring, and there are a lot of people who give it, and let that be funded by the government. So this we thought could have been as one good thing has happened is about the change in the Factoring Act that they've talked about to include non-banking financial companies there. I suppose that will, if it's done well, it will ease out, the large debtors which MSME sector has. I mean, the total working capital blockade is of an order of almost the working capital used to be rotated in MSME sector twice in a year. Now it has become 1.1 to 1.2 times because more and more money is stuck up in receivables,
Right. We're continuing with our analysis of the budget and jobs has been an important story that's raised emotions in India simply because of the numbers that have been shocking India. The unemployment level, the highest in across, 4 to 5 decades now, Kartikeya?
Absolutely.
And the budget, had expectations on it. One of the main expectations is definitely deliver a clear plan on how you're going to create crores and crores of jobs.
Going back to the point he made on LIC, LIC is the biggest, I would say, step taken in this budget. It's the most profitable company. Thousands and thousands of crores of the government's money is applied in the market, but it requires parliamentary sanction. This disinvestment cannot take place through an executive action. So if we say that the government has taken a decision today and by an act of maybe second cabinet or third cabinet or by a meeting they are going to disinvest, it cannot happen. This disinvestment will have to move through both Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha. It's going to generate negative public opinion. And it is also, in terms of concept, it is okay right now. The political climate is such, if you have an agency which creates debt and not working well, people will say, well, said it. It's like Air India. sell it, they don't want it. So the government will have to argue in this public narrative that why are you disinvesting money in a firm which is doing so well? So the story is just not economic. They will have to argue it out politically.
Yeah. Andrew, why don't if I can come to you on that, Andrew. The LIC is the holy cow as far as the Indian market is concerned. You want to maintain it and you want to milk it for eternity, but putting it on the block, how wise a decision do you think it is at this point in time? Maybe it's the only big savior for the government in terms of money that they can get, cash they can get at this point in time.
Well, I have to declare an interest. My father-in-law used to work for the LIC. The LIC is one of the most widely spread and one of the most successful of...
All right, before we get ahead, Andrew, if we're going to make personal declarations, my father too was a long-term employee of the Life Insurance Corporation of India.
As well.
And Mr. Jayant Krishna is dad as well here on our panel. So we're the children of the Life Insurance Corporation of India over here. Continue, please, Mr. Andrew Whitehead. Your take on how wise it is to put it
we
on the
all
block.
have a personal stake in this of some sort.
All right, Andrew, I think we seem to be having a bit of an issue in between all of that with your audio and your video. We need to reconnect with you. Andrew Whitehead talking to us about LIC. I'm going to quickly come to the panel over here before we take it to Andrew Whitehead. Good point raised by Kartikeya about LIC. It's not going to be easy to make that listing happen, but that's the cash cow, so to speak, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's also interesting about LIC is that LIC until now has been the vehicle that they've used to do other kind of internal disinvestments, right? So when they've been trying to sell off shares of some state enterprises to boost the their revenues on their official government books, they've made LIC buy some of the stakes in some of these companies.
So many
right?
IDBI, ONGC, IPOs,
Yeah, so I mean, when you list LIC, it raises the question of will they be able to use it in the way that they've been using it before? I mean, I don't know.
Public trust on
how
LIC.
will investors look at how LIC, because, surely they're not going to list a majority shareholding. The government will still
I would
get
like you to hold your thought for a minute. We are being joined by noted industrialist at the Godrej. So thank you for joining us on our program. And my question, thank you, sir. And my question to you is, what are your first thoughts after listening to this the longest budget ever?
Yeah, there's several announcements in the budget, but nothing very major which to my mind will turn around the economy. So there are some good points and clearly they will help, but I don't see a turnaround in the economy. The economy is in very bad shape. Growth rate is down to 4.5–5%. It needs to be quickly brought back to 6–7%, but none of the provisions been announced today, to my mind, will turn it around fast.
Right, Mr. Godrej, this is Krishna
and
Kumar.
Some of them are.
I want to quickly come in and ask you before you get ahead in terms of why do you think this budget doesn't deliver? Because this is a budget that has the expectations of needing to do something to revive the growth cycle in the country. The dividend distribution tax has been done away with for companies. Income tax cuts have been announced. So where do you think this budget missed a trick or two when it comes to reviving the growth cycle?
No, income tax has not been reduced. It has been, the slabs have been changed, provided you give up exemptions. So it's a substitution. I don't think the income tax rates have been reduced, and one will have to go into details to see. So dividend distribution tax has been removed, which is a good thing, but then it's taxable in the hands of the recipient.
Sir, ideally, what would you have expected from this budget for the industry, which Nirmala Sitharaman should have done this time around?
Well, I think tax rate should have been reduced, not the substitution of exemptions for tax rate reduction. I think that would have provided more money in the hands of consumers. And I think a lot of other things could have been done to get the economy going faster.
Right, Mr. Godrej, as we speak, the stock markets are tanking. They're not happy with the fact that the long-term capital gains tax is still levied and not done away with. But the larger problem that you're talking about in terms of reviving the growth cycle, creating jobs, we've seen lakhs and crores worth of outlay for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, for agriculture, for infrastructure. But do you think that none of this can deal with the structural problems that the Indian economy is facing, that is lack of demand and lack of corporate investment?
Yes, well, it will be useful. I'm not saying that the provisions that have been announced will not be of any use, but I don't think it will turn around the economy.
What do you think was needed in this budget for a turnaround in the economy to take place? What do you think that Nirmala Sitharaman needed to do with this budget that she did not end up doing?
Well, one of the things was tax rates should have been reduced, as she has, but exemptions should not have been removed.
You mean tax rates for both corporates and people alike?
Sorry?
You mean tax rates for the corporates and the general public alike? You would have wanted a steeper cut in the tax rates, both corporate tax rate and income tax rates.
No, corporate tax has already been reduced. I'm talking of the personal income tax rates.
All right.
She has reduced the rates, but then she has said you get the lower rates only if you give up exemptions.
All right, so you're saying that there is no actual cut in income tax rates, it's just an exemption substitution. But apart from that, apart from the income tax, there is a question over even when income tax is cut and more money is there in the hands of the people. There's no guarantee that they'll go and spend it. They might just save it. So that is also not a guaranteed way of boosting demand and growing the economy.
No, I don't think that's a good thing, because unless you study the details, it's difficult to tell which is better, to give up exemptions and take the lower tax rates. Or
Okay, these are the
so one has to see the details. The speech went on too long. Even then she didn't complete it, and she stopped with 2 pages still to be read.
So, once the budget was over and a lot of comments came in from experts, one which is doing the round in the social media was that somehow the budget is not in sync with what was presented in the Economic Survey of India. Do you believe in that the Economic Survey of India and the budget are not in sync?
To a certain extent, I believe that. And I feel the budget should have had more to make sure the economy revives.
Why do you say, sir, that it's not in sync? And if you can just elaborate for our viewers, sir.
Well, the economic survey sounded as if the economy needs a major prop-up, but that wasn't there.
Okay. Well, you're saying that you see
stock market. You see how the stock market has reacted.
So it's
the stock market, Mr. Godrej, is one portion of the target audience of this budget. We are talking about the middle class and the lower middle class in the country. You talked about the fact that the income tax rates haven't come down enough. But really, there is no silver bullet when it comes to reviving the Indian economy.
If it was a good budget, then the stock market would have reacted positively.
All right, fair enough. I just want to understand a couple of important allocations: 99,000 crore rupees for education, 85,000 crore rupees for the scheduled castes, 57,000 crore rupees for the scheduled tribes, 100,000 crore rupee infrastructure pipeline. All of this are important investments to be made from a budget perspective.
Those are not new allocations. Those are the allocations this year. Last year also there were allocations. I don't know, unless one studies the detail, how much more is it than the previous year.
All right, so let's get away with the specificities. Mr. Adi Godrej, your net saying that this is a budget from where there were so many expectations because of the state of the Indian economy, the way it is right now. Things are extremely not taking off the ground. Would you have also expected some measures for the exporters? Because not very good news from this budget 2020 for exporters in India.
Yes, I think we should have had a more growth-oriented budget.
But Karthikeya, you have a question.
Last question, sir. Last question before I let go of you. And I've been asking this to my colleagues and the panelists here also. Do you think that this was a reformist budget, or you feel that it's a statist budget?
No, it is neither. It has made some changes, but I would have expected greater changes because the economy is in bad shape.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. But that's the bottom line. Not a single person.
Good talking to you.
Thank you. Not a single person has said that it's a reformist budget. And when we started this program, I asked this question repeatedly: will we have a reformist budget? Will we have that 1991 movement? I don't think we have one.
And we needed one for the way the economy is going, for the way the Indian economy is finding itself in the larger picture of the global economy. We're still being joined by our very special guests in our studios. We have Richard M. Rosso, we have Amy Kasman, we have Mr. Jayant Krishna. We also have Andrew Whitehead joining us live from Chennai on the broadcaster. Richard, you've been listening to all this jibber-jabber about outlays and fiscal deficit and etc., etc. The larger point Amy Kasman makes and Andrew Whitehead makes and Adi Godrej makes is that Budget 2020 was all about what is your solution to kickstart growth. It's about time. This government has had 7 years in power nearly. It's in the 7th year of power. It's the first budget of the second term, 6th year for the government. And there's been enough time for political vision to take center stage. But that political vision transforming into an economic vision is not happening, is it?
Well, like we talked about in the first segment earlier today, I think Prime Minister Modi, despite a new government 6 years ago, got a lot of big reforms out of the gates the first year. And then it feels like it's been a bit of an empty tank since then, not as many big ideas being put out there. I mean, we know some of the things that would have, I think, stirred the animal spirits, that you can make an announcement and know that execution is relatively easy, although political forces are hard. Like privatizations. There was only one company that was talked about today, LIC with an IPO. FDI caps, single window clearances. Some states now are going to zero window. They're allowing companies to begin operations even before they get their licenses, which makes the difficulty in getting things started is very low. Zero duty for import, for input goods for manufacturing. Land, labor, GST, these things that are jammed up right now, for her to get on stage and talk about the government's vision for getting the toughest reforms done. And instead, no mention really. So we know the things that would have gotten this to be termed a reform budget based on the budgets that Yashwant Sinha presented, that Chidambaram presented and other things. And there was very little of that. If you were a foreign portfolio investor, this was a reformist budget. There was a lot of things on FPIs. There were a few good things on small business, a few good things on startups.
Right, so foreign portfolio investors' perspective, this is a reformist budget, so to speak. But Amy Kasman wants to comment on that. Amy, please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that was important that's announced is that they're raising the limit for foreign investment in corporate bonds. Until now, if you were a corporate that had, bonds, total foreign investment in those bonds could only be 9% of the value of your outstanding corporate bonds. She's raised that to 15%. It's still not a lot, but it is higher. So there's a little more room for a little more money, foreign money, to come in and buy up corporate bonds, which is important because the government is increasing its own borrowing. So there will need to be more money to finance. The big problem in India is that there's been no private investment in the last decade. It's been flat.
Absolutely.
So, you see now the government is cutting taxes, but still they've not been able to kickstart private investment. So here's
this is an important move that can help.
It's a move.
Small yet significant move.
I think it's also about sentiments.
It's a move.
It's like sending the right message.
Yeah. What is the government
80% of the
thinking?
people are saying that right thing has not been done, and I think it has an impact on the economy.
Fair enough, but Karthikeya, I'm afraid we have to take a short breather here at the stage. Absolutely. We have some messages from our sponsors. Please join us, and in less than 2 minutes, our detailed analysis and coverage will continue of India's Budget 2020 right here on WION World is One. Hello and welcome. You're continuing to watch WION World is One's special Indian Budget Day coverage. India's Budget 2020 has been announced by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, and we here at WION World is One are breaking it down for you, reading the fine print, seeing it from every possible angle and telling you what kind of a budget this one has been. Bear in mind, it came with huge expectations. The economy in India needs to revive its growth cycle and kickstart growth, really. Budget 2020 was supposed to provide the solution for it. And I have with me in the studios Amy Kasman, Richard M. Russo and Mr. Jayant Krishna joining us on this broadcast. We also have Andrew Whitehead joining us live from Chennai. Amy, we've been discussing it threadbare in terms of sector versus sector, fiscal deficit target, income tax, corporate tax, outlays, promises, the lack of vision. But net, let's bring it down to, let's level with it. The budget at the end of the day is a very simple document-making process. At the end of the day, all it can do is show intent from the government in terms of what it is thinking. The budget doesn't decide as to how well the final performance on the ground lies. So are we probably expecting a little too much from the budget per se, because the budget needs to be backed by reform? And the question is always what kind of reforms that India has to undertake and not what kind of a budget India needs to make.
I guess in the past, some of the big ticket reforms were announced in Indian budgets, and so people still are looking to the Indian budget for. It's
been a while since that has happened, actually.
Yes, I know, but like hope lives eternal, doesn't it? So I think that's why. But I mean, I think people are also looking for kind of a vision and a plan. And I mean, one of the things that I think, foreign investors, for example, had expected that this year the government would not meet its fiscal deficit target and would deviate from the fiscal glide path that it had outlined. And that came as no surprise, but one thing that I think some investors will have, and this may be also one of the reasons that the market is reacting so not very enthusiastically about the budget, is the fact that...
Not very enthusiastically is an understatement at this stage. 700 points down for the Sensex.
So one of the reasons for that may be that although she's conceded that she's not going to make the fiscal deficit targets for this financial year, which ends on March 31st, and the next financial year, she has not laid out a long-term vision that we've heard yet for how is the government going to return to that fiscal glide path. So there
is 3 words, or rather 2 words.
Clarity.
Long-term vision for the economy, India.
There's no clarity on that, and that's something that can really affect investor sentiment, because in this, it's very important to remember that the government is in competition with its own corporate sector for limited resources for investment. So if the government is spending more or has a bigger fiscal deficit target, either to invest or fund its general operations, that means there's going to be less, or it's going to be more expensive for the corporate sector to raise the money it needs if it indeed wants to invest.
Richard?
You actually hear other ministers and near ministers sometimes that are trying to put a little bit of form and format behind the economy and moves. Minister Piyush Goyal talking about the economy. I think Amitabh Kant, who the Prime Minister's relied on so heavily through many roles there. So, there are 2 others that a lot of times, try to add a narrative behind what you see and try to drive vision and direction. But the finance minister is the most powerful of them all. So hearing it directly from the finance ministry would be terrific. The other folks are obviously they're doers, they're achievers, they're very commercially oriented. But the finance ministry holds the cards.
You're talking like a businessman, aren't you? It's all about like when the government is willing to put the money where the mouth is, then people get more reassured. And budget is all about putting the money where the mouth is, so to speak. Mr. Jayant Krishna, do you think the government did enough in Budget 2020 in terms of putting the money where their mouth is?
I don't get that feeling at all. Few instances, for example, they've taken up LIC as a candidate. But to my mind, which is a difficult candidate, for fructification of the entire the IPO process and so on and so forth. But other entities like ONGC, like NTPC, like Power Grid, their government has a huge holding that could have come down to 51%, and that would have been a relatively easier process to do, and a lot of money could have been generated through that route. That has not been done. If you look at IT-enabled services or some other services, where this SEZ sunset clause, people thought another 5 years they will give and things like that, to stimulate, because that's there also the growth rate has come down in the tech sector. So I think these kind of things could have been done. Even the GST slabs rationalization, fewer number of slabs, perhaps 0 and 2 more slabs, for luxury goods, and that could have happened. More products like petroleum, alcohol coming under GST, all that has not happened. Even
yes,
auto.
Talking about GST, I have to only add over here that for now, yet again, for all those viewing this, tobacco and cigarette products go up, prices go up again post-budget 2020. That much remains as far as budget 2020 and GST is concerned. We're talking about slabs with Jayat Krishna. There's a new slab that's there on our screens right now. That's the income tax slabs. I'm going to bring the focus back for all the viewers watching. That's the income tax rates in India for the financial year 20, beginning now in 2020, in April 2020, extending up to the 31st of March 2021. We had Mr. Adi Godrej, chairman of the Godrej Group, telling us that that cut down in income tax rate is only if the people are willing to forego their exemptions. So in a sense, it's not necessarily a real cut in income tax rates. I'm going to bring in Mr. Andrew Whitehead on that topic. Mr. Andrew Whitehead, if there was ever a big headline from this budget, it was this steep cut in income tax rates. But even that came with strings attached to, so to speak, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, Nirmala Sitharaman said she was reducing interest tax rates and simplifying the income tax structure. When you look at it, we've got lower rates if you forego your various exemptions and deductions. You can, or you have the option of sticking to the current rates and you keep your exemptions and deductions. Now, that is not a simple system. It may be a transitional dual arrangement, but wow, that sounds to me hugely complex. I think there's a bigger issue, though. This government has shown such energy and political determination, for good or ill, in pursuing its Hindutva agenda. It has not shown the same determination in pursuing an approach towards the economy. I'm slightly surprised by that. I thought this budget would be a chance for them to rectify that shortcoming, but it hasn't happened. We've heard from Adi Godrej that corporate India is giving this budget the thumbs down. The markets are giving it the thumbs down. I've yet to hear from anybody who is satisfied by this budget.
All right, you are in Chennai. You know the political climate in Chennai when it comes to the ruling government. So difficult to hear good things about the BJP in Chennai. But we'll hold on to that. In the meanwhile, talking about the markets, Andrew, Sensex is down below the 40,000 mark, 39,866. That's a drop of more than 2%. Sensex down 2% in the red, ladies and gentlemen, below the crucial 40,000, psychological 40,000 mark. I'm going to take that to Richard M. Rosso. Richard, it is Saturday trading. We have to wait until see what happens on Monday, but not good pickings on Saturday for the markets.
No, it's not. I think you're right. I mean, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for the full magnitude of what's in the budget to settle in. When we talk about the tax changes that are happening, what's the impact in the economy? How much are they going to lose on this? I'm sure a lot of folks right now, even as trading is happening, are busy doing their own calculations to find out which companies are winners and losers. Some of these areas that were, frankly, quite surprising. What does LIC's IPO mean for investments in other large insurance companies? So, you got kind of a first wave right now, but as people are doing their own calculations on companies that are going to win and lose and change the economy, you may see a different investor profile coming in, and it could be worse.
And in that sense, what Mr. Jayant Krishna was talking about, the LIC proposal in the budget, is both, from being a happy surprise, it probably is end up being a not so happy surprise for the markets because the kind of uncertainties that it throws up. What is the vision behind how you're going to get it done? The implementation is a completely different ballgame altogether. Amy Casman, you've been typing away for a while now. I want to really ask you, if there was a headline from this budget, there were two big headlines. One is the LIC being listed and unlocking money and cash from it. The other is the income tax, both of which came with serious riders. LIC in terms of how you're going to do it in the first place, and the income tax is just a matter of foregoing exemption and not really a tax cut.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the estimate of how much revenue they're going to lose, it's about $5.6 billion. So compared to the magnitude of the corporate tax cut that they announced last in September after the kind of post-election budget, and then they came up with this huge corporate tax announcement. So this is a lot less, but obviously, I mean, the magnitude of the cut is a lot less, but obviously what they're hoping is that they've targeted it in such a way that it is going to really put the money in the hands of lower middle class families who they hope will have the highest propensity to spend that, because that was the argument that economists were making. If you give a big tax cut to kind of wealthy, highly salaried professionals who already have everything that they could possibly need in life, they're not necessarily going to do much additional spending that's going to revive demand of the Indian economy. They might take more foreign holidays. But if you give it to the kind of lower middle class that are kind of struggling to make ends meet, then, maybe they will just go out and, buy a new appliance or buy a TV or replace a very aging vehicle or buy another motorbike.
Or buy another smartphone.
Or buy another smartphone. So I think they're hoping that they've targeted this income, though the magnitude isn't so much, they've targeted in such a way that it will kind of propel some spending, which is really needed to get the economy off the ground.
It's a good time to remind all those viewing this broadcast that for all the talk, only 7% to 8% of the Indian population are
tax.
Even pays tax. That's the big reality that India deals with. 7 to 8% on the best estimate. We're talking about 7 to 8 maximum percentage of Indian population that actually pays income tax. So the income tax per se was never going to be good enough to revive the growth cycle, to revive demand, because that's that is indicative of money going into a particular hands. But what about the fact that those who don't have the problem of paying income tax simply because they don't have jobs? Because unemployment is at the highest level in India in nearly 5 decades, 45-year high. That's what you're talking about. Budget 2020, if there was any other expectation apart from reviving the growth cycle, it was how are you going to give jobs to so many young Indians? It's a young country. You're churning out graduates in millions and millions every year. How are you going to make sure that people get jobs? Again, on that front, Richard and Jayan, I'm going to begin with Richard. Really no big announcement on what is the job creation mantra.
No. And there was, again, a great pull-out section yesterday in the economic survey that hits exactly on that.
Exactly.
What are the sectors that, if there was additional investment, would create jobs? And you'd expect in that environment, when you've got a difficulty creating jobs in the economy, that the next day when the budget's announced, you would see dramatic action playing to the needs of those sectors to get them to grow. And it was absent, crickets on that point. So the jobs agenda, it appears that helping folks with where they're at right now, farmers, basic living, more of a focus than actually trying to stimulate that economy. So a big swing and a miss, economic survey to budget.
Right, Mr. Jayan Krishna.
Yeah, please. So I'll come to jobs in a minute. But on skills front, there were some bright ideas they could have tried, which they've not done. I mean, if you look at our graduates, only 10% of them are employable. How do you mainstream employability skills right from school till the undergrad level? So that whatever deficit we have in the quality of education, in the actual learning outcomes, those are compensated to some extent. That was one big idea they could have done. Apprenticeship. No matter what you learn in a classroom, but unless you soil your hands the German way, you won't learn, kind of a thing. So, we had proposed actually that apprenticeship could perhaps become a law. I mean, there's already a law there. There's an act there. But how does it become compulsory at the undergrad level? 6 months window given in the 3 or 4 year program where people go and work in the industry and learn the hard way. So even third idea there is that, corporates have not come forward to skill, the community on a large scale, except a few exceptions like Tata's, Larsen & Toubro and things like that. Right. So I think that could have been done. Coming to the jobs, see, if you look at manufacturing space, the kind of investments which are happening in our country or elsewhere in the world, they are capital intensive. They are not employment intensive at all. But having said so, there are still a few sectors which have the propensity to attract, to create a lot of jobs, like leather, footwear, like, what do you call it, apparel, kind of a thing, which is still a very, very huge.
Exactly. Textile exports, incidentally, are the highest exports from India even now. And the problem with the fact is that Indian exports have been stuck in the $300 billion range for the last decade.
Absolutely. So if you look at China as a country, there the wage bill for leather and apparel sector has gone up so much that a lot of their customers are looking at alternate market. But if there is a credible story of incentivizing these two sectors in our country, I think it can, because in foreseeable future, these two sectors will not be affected by Industry 4.0. Technologies, so they'll remain employment-centric, which is a very, very big thing for a populous country like ours.
And most importantly, push the Indian overall value of Indian exports up. The more the Indian exports go up, the more can we compensate for the increasing import bill. Absolutely. Because we are the second largest consumers of oil in the world, and we're going to need more and more energy demands. And the geopolitical situation in terms of the energy demand is not that great. Crude prices have been easing up. So it's a very important stage to balance out trade. And Mr. Jayant Krishna, who was also the CEO of NSDC, making a point about skill development, especially in sectors like the leather business and the apparel business, which can boost the sectors individually and consequently contribute to exports and the economy. Meanwhile, let me take this across to Mr. Andrew Whitehead as well. Mr. Andrew Whitehead, Mr. Jayant Krishna making a point about skill development and also highlighting how there is talk of jobs in that National Economic Survey, 8 crore jobs by the year 2030. It sort of set the tone really for the budget, but the budget not really following through with it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we got lots of platitudes, and Nirmala Sitharaman coined this rather nice, though not entirely original phrase, that digital is the new oil. She talked about the aim of employing many more youngsters in the digital arena, but didn't quite explain how it would happen. But on the income tax issue, I'm sorry to come back to this, but I think it's rather interesting. 7% of Indians pay income tax. In Delhi, it's a much, much higher percentage. And I do wonder whether that headline about the lower income tax rates is partly with the Delhi Assembly elections.
All right.
The BJP needs
Andrew,
to pull something out of their hat
that,
if they're going to have a chance there.
If you're going to discuss that, let's. I also want to get in with you on the whole Delhi election bit of it all. We've also seen a 4,400 crore rupee allocation to fight Delhi's air pollution in this budget. We're talking about voting for the Delhi elections, which begins on the 8th of February, and the 11th of February is when the results are going to be announced. One budget arriving 1 week before the Delhi elections clearly means there is enough and more political messages to give out to the public in Delhi, isn't it, Andrew Whitehead?
I think it is, and I think that the budget is always a political event. This year doesn't have the number of state elections that is common in India, but it does have, as you say, the Delhi Assembly elections coming just days after the budget, or with voting starting just days after the budget. And the BJP has an alibi ready if it doesn't do well in Delhi, but clearly it would like to replicate the huge success it had in the city in May. And given the importance of the lower middle class vote in Delhi, I wonder whether these new lower income tax rates are trying to wean people back to how they voted in May, rather than, and I was in Delhi in May, many people were saying it's the BJP for national elections, but we're happy for Kejriwal to continue here in Delhi. Now, if they can win people back, but I think it's difficult, and my suspicion is it's not going to work, but that must have been part of their thinking, I think.
Andrew Whitehead, with a political perspective, interesting to discuss that, isn't it? Because we haven't discussed that aspect of it all, because it's the 1st of February on which Budget 2020 has been presented. 8th of February is voting for the Delhi elections. Clearly, two things standing out from that budget. One is the income tax announcement. Huge percentage of Delhi pays income tax, much higher than the national average of about 7%. At the same time, a special allocation to fight Delhi's air pollution. We're just coming off a winter season in which we'll witness some of the worst air that Delhi has ever witnessed in its own history. Can this turn the tide in favor of the BJP in the Delhi elections? I'm going to ask that question to Amy Kazman. Amy, do you think these little factors can impact the Delhi elections at this stage?
It's hard to say, really. I think that the Delhi election has got a pretty interesting dynamic going. Arvind Kejriwal is obviously trying to campaign on, his track record of working very diligently over the last 5 years to try to improve public services that are used by precisely the lower middle class. Wealthy Delhiites at high salaries are not using, the government public schools and the government public hospitals, but many millions of people do use them. And I think that the government has had a big focus on trying to improve the quality of these services, and there are some indications that suggest that they've actually done a reasonably good job of it. So he's very diligently trying to focus on his record. And then you have a situation where the BJP is trying to really cast his election in very different terms as India versus Pakistan, and, communal issues and law and order, and kind of tapping in, somehow trying to blame Arvind Kejriwal for the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which Arvind Kejriwal is studiously trying to kind of avoid making any statement at all about. So it's a kind of a strange election dynamic, actually.
Right. Mr. Jayant Krishna, it is a strange election dynamic, but difficult to not see the messaging from the BJP through the budget for the Delhi elections.
I don't think it will make any major impact on Delhi elections for two reasons. The two things that you picked up, the 4,000 crore outlay for pollution, to fight the pollution menace, that's not just for Delhi. It's for almost the entire North India. All North Indian cities are suffering from that. And second, what's the other thing you said? The income tax. The income tax, we're not too clear under the two scenarios where you forego exemptions and opt for lower rates versus the earlier regime. So how much? I don't know why those tables are not out, but within a few minutes of budget announcement, normally a person earning this saves this much under this. So still there's a confusion whether people are actually saving money.
Jayant, I think we will be discussing this income tax for a while now, because when it was announced, ladies and gentlemen, for all those watching this broadcast, when it was announced, we felt this was a steep cut in the income tax rates. We're still analysing and understanding this better because the cuts in income tax rates and the recalibration of the slabs that have been announced, the cut in the income tax rates is only if the taxpayer is willing to forego the exemptions associated with the income tax. So we do not know at this point in time how much is the actual difference in terms of income tax paid by people. How much will it differ? How much lesser will it be, or will it be exactly the same? We do not know that at this point in time. But then again, we are discussing that simply because that's how this entire budget has been. On your screens right now, 0 to 2.5 lakh rupees, zero tax as it was before, 2.5 to 5 lakh rupees per annum, 5% tax, and that remains the same as well. But the change begins from 5 to 7.5 lakh rupees. The tax rate was 20%. Now it's 10%. 7.5 to 10 lakh rupees. The tax rate was 20%. It has now been cut down to 15%. 10 to 12.5 lakh rupees, the tax rate was 30%, and that has been now brought down to 25%, whereas the 15 lakhs and above category, the tax rates remain at 30%. On your screens right now, those are the big differences in terms of how much tax rates have come down, but all those are the rates of income tax that have come down only if the taxpayer is willing to forego exemptions. So that's what we understand at this point in time about these income taxes. So don't go by the numbers on your screens clearly. Please check with your chartered accountant. Please check with your auditor and make your calculations in terms of how much tax you will be paying for this year as we continue to break it down. Let's move away from income tax for a bit, and because income tax is one of the ways of driving consumer demand, of improving consumer sentiment. But then it always comes with that rider. What if the extra cash in the hands of the middle class remains in savings and not exactly in elsewhere? We will move away from that. The other problem, it's a twin-edged sword that the Indian economy has been facing. One is the fact that the general public are not willing to spend enough. They're buying lesser and lesser of essential commodities. You've seen FMCG companies' revenue growth and volume growth reduce. But the larger point is that companies who invest, the corporates, their sentiment, because they need to invest and they need to have greater outlays, they need to have the confidence to invest in this economy. Did you think that Budget 2020 did anything to assuage those fears, which seem to have hit an all-time high by the time 2020 has rolled around?
No, they offered the big tax cut already, which is the tool that mainly you can use through a budget to stimulate demand. There were some small pieces. They talk about, for instance, the government of India paying its own bills to small producers and suppliers on a faster basis and getting more of them online, which is useful. So there's some small bells and whistles, but overall, the bigger stuff that has to happen there, are they going to mess around with the GST rates? Are they going to move on land acquisition? Are they going to move on labor laws? These are the kind of things that industry says they need to be able to surge out and grow, and those aren't things that can be included in the budget. Could have got a mention in the budget speech to provide that vision, but in the budget itself wouldn't have been part of it. So I think they spent their biggest bullet for the corporate sector by announcing midstream that big corporate tax cut a few months ago. There was some thinking that they might go a little further this time around, but with the fiscal situation as it is, that would have been perhaps damaging, especially with international rating agencies' appearances.
All right. Amy Kasman, international ratings agencies and et cetera, is where this conversation is heading at this point in time. How do you think, these ratings agencies and others who foretell what to expect from the Indian economy, how do you think they will view this budget?
Look, I think that there was expectation. I think ratings agencies had expected that the government would slip from its fiscal deficit target. But so it's good. They've announced it and that was expected. But I think what ratings agencies will now be looking at is the credibility of the estimates that the government has given for its revenue collection. So it's set a super ambitious target for divestment of public sector enterprises and raising revenues from that. And it's a target that's nearly double of last year's target. Now, admittedly, last year is a different kind of year because it was election year, so couldn't really do a lot of quick privatization. It was a different kind of year
for the economy as well, actually.
Yeah, so, I think...
Not the good, different kind of year.
So India, they've announced this 3.5% fiscal deficit target for the new year that'll start April 1. I think credit agencies will be looking very closely at the assumptions that underpin that target about how much disinvestment revenues are you, expecting to get? How realistic is that projection? What are your tax revenue projections? And of course, we have this complete wild card of the coronavirus. Raging in China right now, that's actually going to have serious impact on the global economy. And so far, India has only one confirmed case. But this is still very much an unfolding situation.
Absolutely.
And when you see what's happening in China and how China is being cut off, it has kind of slightly unforeseeable impacts for the global economy. And it's hard to know exactly how India could also be hit by this.
Yes.
And as I mentioned earlier, there's also, I think, a desire to see India. It's understandable that India is deviating from its fiscal deficit, reduction program now in this year. But I think what, people will want to be seeing, and I haven't seen it anywhere, is, what is the plan to get back to the path of fiscal consolidation after this year? So I think those are some of the things that rating agencies will be looking at very closely.
I bet the plan is, we're going to grow into it. They're talking about growth numbers bouncing back so quick. At some
point, there was a mention about a 10%
nominal
GDP growth. 10% nominal GDP growth. It was followed by, with the opposition members in the parliament raising their voice. 10%. What are you talking about? We just recalibrated our current year growth to 5%, and the best we can do next year is 6.5%. We'll have to wait and watch about the 6.5% figure in the first place. Can we do 6.5 at the stage when we're going from 5 and lesser? That's a big question. Let me quickly bring in Mr. Andrew Whitehead as well. Mr. Andrew Whitehead, this growth story, Indian growth story, remaining stable, this is something that India has talked about for the last 5 to 6 years. No matter what happens, no matter how slow the world grows, India is still one of the fastest growing economies. Unfortunately, it's not the fastest growing economy in India anymore because Bangladesh is. But before we come to you, Andrew, our Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is speaking. Let's cut across live and listen in.
The intention is to reduce the rates as much as to simplify the structure. We wanted to be sure that money is in the hands of the people by not paying a tax which they don't need to pay, in the sense the rate can be brought down where we can bring it down, particularly for the middle class and the lower middle class. We have brought the income tax down. So, if you go by the way in which we organized the corporate rate tax cut, in September when the corporate tax was reduced, even there the pattern was similarly adopted. Those who want those exemptions and other things can continue with the old. And those who are looking for a simplified rate, a reduced rate, and a simple process could adopt the new. The same principle is in our minds when we designed this. Eventually, we want to bring the rates down and remove the complications that are there in the compliance. Too many exemptions, it's very difficult for the administrators to administer it. As much as too many exemptions, you need an expert to keep advising you as to how you plan your taxation. So we wanted to achieve two goals: make our intentions clear that we want to simplify the income tax process. We want to reduce the rates. So to achieve both, we have come up this year with a new scheme with very limited exemptions to it. Ideally, a new scheme without any exemptions would have been the best, but still, because there are some exemptions which are absolutely indispensable, and therefore we have brought in those exemptions to it and kept it at the minimum. Those who still want to have the benefit of those exemptions which they have been using for some years can remain in the old system. So we provided both. with an intention that in the long run, we will be gradually able to remove all exemptions, and in India, your personal income tax, the entire framework should be simple and a very low rate without difficulties in compliance. With that said, I have also read out the examples of people who don't want any exemption in the old, don't want any exemption in the new. What will be the benefit? I've also given you in my speech example of, all right, some benefits in old and some benefits in new, what do you tend to benefit? The new scheme has been designed in such a way that you definitely benefit in terms of the money which is going to be remaining in your hand, having not to pay a higher income tax. With that said, I'll ask the Revenue Secretary to tell you which are those exemptions which are part of the new scheme now. With the reduced rate and with those few exemptions, what will be the benefit that anyone can get will be obvious from his answer. Revenue Secretary.
We took a very comprehensive review of all exemptions, and what we found that there are close to 120 exemptions, all different kinds of exemptions. For example, the amount received by a member of a Hindu united family from the income of family state, share of a Hindu undivided family from an income of family state, share of profit received by a partner, interest on certain notified securities, interest on masala bonds, income of foreign diplomats, income of employee, consultant and family members under technical assistance program, death come retirement gratuity. So this way there was a huge list. And so we took a review of each item, and then we found that in this new regime, as has been explained by the finance minister, that the whole idea was to offer a simplified regime and also lower the tax rate, because there were large number of people who, because of cash constraints, the amount of the income that they were having, they were not able to take all benefits. And some people were able to take a larger number of exemptions and deductions. So in order to offer a simplified system and also to help those who are not taking an exemption, offer a lower tax rate, this system has been introduced. That now the total number of exemptions which have been removed from the new system is about 70. So in fact, I will give you some example that which one have been removed and which one have been retained. So particularly the important ones which have been retained in the new system would be like the retirement benefits, for example. Death come retirement gratuity for government employee, no limit. For others up to 20 lakh, it was already there, they will be retained. Commutation of pensions will be retained. Then the leave encashment on retirement, that will be retained. Retrenchment compensation will be retained. Amount received on VRS up to 5 lakh, that will be retained. Similarly, the EPFO, the employer contribution up to a certain limit, whatever limit that is there now, that will be retained. Payment received from NPS, National Pension Scheme on closure, partial withdrawal from NPS, they all will be retained. A scholarship granted to meet the cost of education, that will be retained. Then payment of awards instituted in public interest, that will be retained. So similarly, so these are the things which will be retained. Then and then there are 70 exemptions, as I mentioned.
You that probably put it all in the net.
Yeah. Yes, so I will put it on.
So that will be clearer for you.
Yes.
Okay, we take next question, 13. Ma'am, just you will get the details. Question number.
Timsy, when there's more money in your hand, and you, the person who has it, will be better in a position to decide where you want to save, instead of me directing it. So I'm allowing you to have more money in your hand and depend on your judgment where you want to place your savings.
मैम दिस इज़ मोनिका फ्रॉम जी बिजनेस. मैम मेरा सवाल है कि आपने कहा कि पार्शियल क्रेडिट गारंटी स्कीम में रिवीजन करने की ज़रूरत है. आपने हाल ही में कुछ रिलैक्सेशंस अनाउंस करे थे, तो अब हम क्या स्पेसिफिक मेजर्स उसमें एक्सपेक्ट कर सकते हैं? और दूसरा ये है कि रियल एस्टेट सेक्टर जो वन ऑफ द टॉप एम्प्लॉयमेंट जनरेटर्स है, उसके लिए आपने कुछ भी अनाउंस नहीं करा, बल्कि उन्हें बहुत ज़्यादा एक्सपेक्टेशन थी कि एटलीस्ट एक वन टाइम लोन रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग स्कीम जो है की घोषणा हो जाएगी. तो क्या कारण रहा उसके पीछे?
No, actually for the real estate, we had announced some things even earlier. We had announced that stalled projects which need to be completed will be given the last mile funding so that that project can be completed. Home buyers will be getting the project. That is already ongoing. Now, in this also, we have extended the date by 1 year so that if it's affordable housing, the exemption which the home buyer has is available for them, and the tax holiday for the real estate people, promoters, is also extended by 1 more year. So actually they can now seek the buyer and benefit from it once the transaction gets over. So we've actually given something much more than what was announced even before the budget for the real estate sector.
29. Next question,
That's
29.
Already ongoing. Na?
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon, ma'am. Sapna Das here from CNBC TV 18. You've also created a lot of buzz with your new divestment target of 2110 lakh crore estimated for FY21. Ma'am, you have clearly mentioned that, out of this amount, around 90,000 crores is what you're looking at via sale of stake in public sector banks and financial institutions. Could you please explain that to us? And also IDBI, sir.
So the target which has been specified, FM has already mentioned it during the budget speech. It is essentially to come from the listing of the LIC.